From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. Thanks for joining us. First up, out of Iowa State University, Lee Schulz with this week's cattle market commentary. Among other things, Lee will look at an apparent decline in the number of cattle being finished in smaller feedlots and how that impacts the perception of overall cattle supplies. Then K-State's Sandy Johnson will talk about determining stocking rates for the cow herd on crop residue, which she says can be calculated a couple of ways. Sandy also looks at supplemental feeding that might be necessary as cows graze that crop stover. And on this week's 4-H segment, K-State's Pam van Horn is joined by a 4-H member from Stevens County, Sydney Beesley. Sydney was recently bestowed an honor at the National 4-H Hall of Fame ceremony. All that here on Agriculture Today.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
You're tuned in to Agriculture Today. For our weekly look at the cattle markets, we turn now to a livestock economist out of Iowa State University, Lee Schulz. Lee's put together a package of comments and information on the state of the industry right now and some interesting things to think about in the cattle feeding sector. First off, though, Lee, just looking back at the fed cattle trade this past week, it's really hard to get a grip on what happened because the trade was somewhat ill-defined.
I think choppy is a good word for it. You know, we did see markets start out the week down, and then we seen a rally midweek, and then we closed down for the week. And so overall, when we look at live cattle futures, we did see them below the previous week. We did expire the October contracts. I think a little bit of action was that on the December contract was narrowing that spread, and so that's why we've seen a large decrease in the December contract, and that maybe flowed through to the remaining deferred contract. Bit surprising on the feeder cattle futures. We did see all the deferred contracts up slightly, but still we did see some positive sentiment there. Corn futures were up, so again, that was a little bit of a surprise. Maybe you can kind of note, too, it's been pretty strong cash trade for feeder cattle. We did see a few less auction sales last week, and so maybe that helped really spur the feeder cattle futures.
But you mentioned also the corn trade, and that's something that bears watching closely if, in fact, there is further strength in the corn market from here forward, right?
I think that is one headwind that we really could point to when we look at calf and feeder cattle prices is we've really, this market has shown that it hasn't really diminished because of the larger supplies. And so I think it would take something like higher corn costs, higher feed costs, or a large impact on the fed cattle to really impact where feeder cattle are at. You know, we're really seeing a premium out when we look into 2019. Live cattle futures, especially that April contract. And so I think that's really going to help hold feeder cattle up really in the near term. And maybe what we're really watching now is the corn prices.
You wanted to share something that you've observed lately, Lee, and that is that packers are, as you put it, being more aggressive in their forward purchases. What's happening there?
Well, this comes from USDA's report, LMCT 153. It's the National Weekly Direct Slaughter Cattle, Prior Week Slaughter, and Contract Purchases. So this report really kind of gives you an idea of what's going on for the future market as far as basis forward contracts. And when we look at pricing out further, or at least volumes out, packers have a lot less cattle forward contracted than they have historically. And so I think, you know, they are interested in securing some of their needs as we go throughout the next several months. And really this last week, we've seen a lot of strength in basis levels for March, April, May. Some of those basis levels were from $1 to $4 over the board, but we've even seen cases of $8 and higher over the board. And so I think they're really aggressively looking to book needs we get out into the early part of 2019.
Mm-hmm. This would seem to suggest that there is packer optimism about profitability ahead if they are advanced pricing at this kind of pace this early then.
Well, I think the optimism, yes, comes from very strong demand and where they see prices out into the future, but also it comes from their current profitability. We've really seen a run of packer profitability. When you look at it from a gross packer margin standpoint, the difference between the cutout plus the byproduct minus the cattle price has really been running historically high this year. And so I think that really gives them a lot of incentive to book needs to really maintain their profit levels.
So that's an encouraging sign. We'll keep an eye on that for sure. Lee, you just put a write-up together that actually focuses on the Iowa cattle feeding industry, but this could have repercussions far more broadly, actually, throughout the cattle feeding sector in this country. You've been looking at the structure of the industry and where the numbers are, so to say. You might explain.
Well, when I refer to structure, I'm really looking at the large feedlots, so over 1,000 head capacity, and then the small feedlots under 1,000 head capacity. And why we define it that way is USDA defines it in that way when you look at the cattle on feed report. So nationally, the cattle on feed report is all feedlots over 1,000 head capacity, and they survey 16 states, which represent about 98% of that inventory, to give us a good barometer of both the cattle on feed, the placements, and the marketing's number. Now, Iowa supplements that with also a less than 1,000 head capacity feedlot, and the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship does that because really, historically, we've marketed about half of the cattle in the state from the small feedlots and half of the cattle from the large feedlots. And what we've seen recently is really a possible sign of structural change where we've really seen less cattle on feed, really lowest numbers since 1996, from that small farmer feeder or less than 1,000 head capacity feedlot. Now, historically, when corn prices are cheap, which I would say they are right now, we see producers walk the corn off the farm through marketing cattle, but really we haven't seen that here the last several months.
Any speculation as to why that is, that we see fewer of these farmer feeders building their numbers?
Well, I think if it's truly a structural change, I think it may be possibly that larger feedlots are just better able to capitalize on economies of scale, and that's really led to their expansion. If it's less of a structural change and maybe just a status of the current times, I think it could be that just we've seen strength in feeder cattle prices, and maybe smaller feedlots are more price sensitive to that. And so instead of paying those high feeder cattle prices, they're really just staying on the sidelines and waiting where they can better match what they're paying for feeder cattle and what they're receiving for fed cattle.
And you do think that this is a trend that could extrapolate throughout other parts of the country then?
Well, I think to some degree. So when we look at nationally, 87% of the cattle are marketed from these large feedlots, or over 1,000 head plus capacity as USDA defines them. But there are states, not just Iowa, that have a large share of farmer feeder operations. And so I think it could point to there are implications for other states. In the short term, where I think it very much has relevance is that there's been a lot of talk about we have very high cattle on feed inventories, as well as a lot of inventories that are cattle on feed over 120 days. And so that suggests that, we could start talking about currentness in this market. Delayed marketings could have an impact on prices. But when you take into account that likely smaller farmer feeders are holding less cattle, I think that backs off a little bit of the indictment of that we may be having issues with currentness. So I think, when we look at the cattle on feed report, you have to take a little bit of grain of salt because it's only representing the large feedlots, and the small feedlots historically could have held quite a few cattle at this time of year.
So the message there basically is the industry shouldn't get in much of a panic about overburdensome supplies.
Yes, I think that's very much the case, that, we're going to monitor these cattle on feed reports like we always do, and very much are interested in what those marketing numbers are, because we want to make sure that feedlots are maintaining currentness and we aren't building market-ready supplies, because that would definitely impact prices. But I think you have to look at it from, this is only one snapshot. We can look at some other data like weights have a very good indication of how current we are. Slaughtering rates are suggesting that we are maintaining currentness. So all those factors together, I think, suggest that we're in a pretty good spot as far as the cattle feeding industry being current, and that shouldn't have any real impact on prices in the short term.
And not to overlook the demand side, in that same article that you note that we're sitting pretty well there by and large.
I think that's the case. Demand, historically, it's very difficult to predict. Unlike supply is very much a balance sheet approach, and I think we have a pretty good idea of our supply situation. Demand's a little bit more difficult because we're looking at both quantity and prices and how that's, impacting the push through of prices to the live animals. But there's a lot of good signs right now. We're seeing strength in the box beef price, really driven by middle meats, briskets, that are really helping support that cutout above year-ago levels. So if we have higher supplies plus higher prices, that's a very good indication of demand. We're entering the holiday season here, so there is some competition from other protein sources, but so far sales have been very good for beef, and that's another good sign. The economy is in good position. Unemployment rates are really historically low. That's another barometer to suggest. The real wild card is always exports. Year-to-date exports have been very strong, but as we've seen with, beef as well as other proteins, we can see large impacts on those exports. I think right now forward sales are looking very strong, at least for 2018. Really something to monitor here in the next several weeks is what those sales for 2019 look like, because I think that could have an impact on end-of-year prices for cattle.
Well, it's good input for our producers to consider out there. And as always, Lee, we appreciate your time and your comments, and we'll catch up with you again in the not-too-distant future.
Thank you.
That's Lee Schulz. He's a livestock economist at Iowa State University, and he contributes regularly to our cattle market segment here on Agriculture Today.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
We're back now on this Agriculture Today. This next segment for you cow-calf producers managing your cow herd on that crop residue as a grazing resource. Sandy Johnson has joined us once again. She's a livestock specialist, K-State Research and Extension, based in northwest Kansas. Well, crop residue is touted as an excellent feedstuff, but knowing how to manage it and what's out there is pretty important, Sandy.
Yeah, that's right. We really appreciate being able to use the crop residue as a way to reduce winter feed costs, let that cow to continue to work. And from the standpoint of crop production, as she picks up that volunteer corn, why we don't have to worry about dealing with that the following year. And I'm not sure about the rest of the state, but northwest Kansas, I think the husks that are in the road ditches and in Oklahoma really are not helping the corn producers' residue. And so when that cow consumes crop residues and leaves manure on the field, that's at least half of that corn husk that stays there as opposed to blows away.
One of the frequent questions that comes up, the recommended stocking rate on a given field of residue. Are there standards to go by there, or does one have to play that by ear based on what residue content they have available out there?
Well, we can certainly make some good starting points based on the grain yield that's there. If we look at corn residue, often an irrigated corn with, in this 2.25, 250 bushel type of corn yield, that we can have one mature cow there for 60 days, and a dry land situation, which actually is a fairly variable number in terms of crop yield, might be one mature cow per month of grazing. But if we want to really dial that down a little bit more closely, there's a couple ways that we can do that. One of the rules of thumb you can use is to divide the corn yield by 3.5 and get number of grazing days. There's another way to approach that looks at the grain yield. Then, depending on the crop, we have an index value, and for both corn and grain sorghum, that's an index of 60. So we would we had a 70 bushel grain sorghum crop, we'd multiply that times 60, figure that we had 4,200 pounds of residue per acre, graze about half of it, and so if we had 2,100 pounds of residue and a cow was going to eat 30-some pounds a day, then we could make that calculation on roughly how long we could leave those animals out there. Now with our grain sorghum, I think we have a variety of different cutting heights and some different varieties in terms of how tall they are now, and so some of those indexes may not be as appropriate as they were at one point, but those all provide starting points of where we might go, and anytime we're setting a stocking rate, whether it's for pasture or crop residue, we've got to pay attention to what's going on and how our estimate matches what's actually there.
You cited a number there, 30 pounds per day consumption on the part of the cow. Is that a pretty steady number to go by in terms of determining that consumption rate?
We could drill that down more precisely based on what we're supplementing her, and that's essentially a round number from, a 1,250-pound cow, and we think she'll eat so much of her body weight per day, and then we have to make it from, we usually talk about that on a dry matter basis, and then we convert it to as-fed, and so 30 is a round number that's pretty close to maybe 27 or 28. That might be what the actual number was, depending on the weight of the cow and what we were supplementing.
And to that latter point, on supplementation for the cow herd on grazing stover, what degree of supplementation is required and in what form? These are another set of questions, actually.
You bet. And anytime we're looking at that ration, it depends on what it is what type of animal and stage of production, and what type of performance that we need. Often we have a mature cow that's not lactating and doesn't really need to gain a lot of body condition. And if the group of cows fits that description, as long as we have a little bit of grain going through that cow, that we can still see that in the manure, or we're well within these, say it was a dry land piece, we were within that first 30 days of grazing, we probably don't need additional supplementation because the cow is able to select some of the higher quality stuff. As we get later in a crop residue season and the quality of that declines, even if it's your first 30 days on that piece and it's now February 1st, we may need to adjust that some. Now, secondly, if we want to put a little condition on those cows, or we have young animals that are still growing, we will need to provide some supplementation. I think oftentimes people have heard about, I know there was some work in Nebraska that talked about supplementing mature cows on crop residue, and that, as I've indicated early in that period, they don't need to be supplemented, or if you graze per their recommendations or pay attention to how much crop residue there is and not try to use the crop residue as a winter dry lot, then that need for supplementation is greatly reduced. If we're hanging out there a long time and trying to get them to clean up every last little bit, that's a whole different ball of wax.
Right.
So if we, go out there, try and get the candy off and move on to another piece, or at least have an appropriate number of animals for that, minimal supplementation is needed. We'll need to provide, salt and trace mineral supplementation that we would normally provide year-round.
But if you're intending on leaving the herd on that site until that residue is grubbed down to nearly nothing, one will have to stair-step their supplementation up accordingly, right?
Right. And that's, to me, really, that becomes that you're using it as a dry lot. And so they have long since got the candy, and the quality of that corn stalk versus the husks and any leaves that are there is much different.
One thing that should be brought in here at some point, the obvious need for a water resource on that stover where there might not normally be a stream or a pond. So one will have to provide that, and that has to be considered.
Right. We know those cows aren't going to drink as much during the winter and the cool weather as they will in the summer, but generally you're going to need at least 10 gallons a day for most of our mature, typical size of cows. So if that's not on site, that does need to be hauled there. And I think we need to make sure that as we're looking at the cost of crop residue grazing, maybe we're driving there every day to look at them, and so taking water along is not really an additional charge, but it can be expensive to haul water, and that needs to be part of the calculation. And don't be tempted to use something to haul water in that had something like nitrogen fertilizer in it. You'll be sorely disappointed,
to say the least. That can cause damage, even cattle losses, if it goes to an extreme.
Right.
And just as an additional note here, you've just posted on the ksubeef.org website a brand new crop residue survey that K-State Research and Extension conducted over last winter into this past spring, and that sheds some light on such things as the charges per acre that one might be paying for crop residue and other details, right?
Right. The ranges we got from a per acre basis ranged from $4 to $50. Now, I don't think there's probably too many people actually paying $50, and the $50 was actually cited by a producer that did not allow crop residue grazing, so that was his impression of what it was worth for him to not graze it, I think. But our per head per day basis, which is another way people calculated, or anywhere from 10 cents to $1 per head per day. Now, I think somewhere in that middle range is probably a little more common. But again, it's going to depend on, how much is there, about the fence and the water, and a lot of those things that go into making those agreements. And for your listeners that find this information valuable, when your extension agent asks you to cooperate with providing some of that information on your experience, why we really appreciate those that are willing to share that and shed a little light on some of those agreements, because that's the only, we can hear a little gossip down at the coffee shop, but we really would like a broader range of gossip with more detail at times.
And again, producers, you can have a look at this crop residue survey from K-State Research and Extension and what it had to say at ksubeef.org. Sandy, we appreciate all of these remarks on crop residue grazing, and we'll talk again soon. Many thanks to you.
Glad to be here.
Sandy Johnson is a livestock specialist for K-State Research and Extension. Agriculture Today is back in a few moments. This is the K-State Radio Network.
While many people know hunger is an issue in developing countries, it is also a problem in our own backyards. In 2010, 1 in 7 Kansans struggled to put adequate food on the table. 2 K-State Research and Extension programs are tackling this problem. The Family Nutrition Program and Expanded Food and Nutrition Education Program reach thousands of Kansans in more than 70 counties. They learn how to eat healthy with a low budget. For more information about these programs, visit ksre.ksu.edu.
You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, coming to you from the campus of Kansas State University. Eric Atkinson here, as we move ahead now with today's agricultural news headlines, courtesy in part of DTN. The EPA has extended the registration of 3 dicamba herbicides, Extendamax, Fexapan, and Ingenia, for use over the top of soybeans and cotton through the 2020 growing season. The EPA has not yet released the dicamba labels, but the agency published a press release that shed some light on the changes in the use of these restricted use pesticides. In the past, states have used Section 24C of the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act to pass more restrictive state rules on federal pesticide labels. The EPA told DTN that it wants to work with the states using 24C if necessary. The agency said if a state wishes to modify the over-the-top labels for dicamba in order to better meet the state's circumstances, the EPA will work with them to support their goals. The new federal dicamba labels will limit spraying the herbicides from 1 hour after sunrise to 2 hours before sunset. That's a provision aimed at limiting applications during temperature inversions. The new labels will also ban over-the-top dicamba applications 45 days after planting in the case of soybeans and 60 days after planting for cotton. These restrictions are an effort to stay out of the heat of the summer when the volatilization is most likely to occur, according to EPA Region 7 Administrator Jim Gulliford in talking with DTN. For 2019 and 20, only individuals who have been certified by their state to use restricted-use pesticides will be able to spray, mix, or load dicamba. All post-emergence applications of dicamba herbicides in 2019 will require a 110-foot downwind buffer. In counties where endangered species may exist, applications will also have to abide by a new 57-foot buffer around the other sides of the field. Now, later this week, we're planning to visit with K-State weed management specialist Dallas Peterson about these updated rules on treating dicamba-resistant crops and about the research that he and K-State colleagues have been doing on dicamba applications. The Trump administration has nearly finalized a much-awaited revised definition of which waterways are subject to the agency's jurisdiction under the Clean Water Act. That, according to Acting EPA Administrator Andrew Wheeler. The White House Office of Management and Budget is currently reviewing the proposal, and the EPA hopes to publish it for public comment by the end of this month. Wheeler said the new definition of navigable waters will be consistent with the views of the late Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia, and will make clear that federal jurisdiction under the law only includes relatively permanent waters and wetlands with a continuous surface connection to relatively permanent waters. The new definition is likely to draw support from farmers and developers who have long been frustrated with the EPA's efforts to define which waters may be subject to a federal permitting requirement under the CWA. Agricultural interests, pesticide manufacturers, home builders, and other industry groups say that the Obama-era WOTUS rule illegally expanded federal authority. The National Association of Manufacturers filed suit to block the rule, as did attorneys general, that is, from 30 states. This new definition will clarify the question of jurisdiction, according to Wheeler. Well, South Korea is already a big customer for U.S. agricultural products, but a trade mission there this week could make that nation an even bigger customer. Here's more from the USDA's Gary Crawford.
From Monday the 5th through Thursday the 8th, another USDA trade mission, number 7 so far this year.
This one led by my good friend and colleague, Ken Isley, as he takes a good, strong delegation to South Korea.
That's Undersecretary of Agriculture Ted McKinney. Ken Isley is the administrator of USDA's Foreign Agricultural Service. Going with him, nearly 50 representatives of dozens of U.S. farm and food commodities, including grains and oilseeds, fruits, tree nuts, and many more, plus officials from the ag departments of Georgia, Virginia, Missouri, and Nebraska. Ted McKinney says it's mostly a sales mission. Not much to talk about on the trade agreement front. The new U.S.-Korean trade deal is pretty much settled, and since U.S. and Korean food and ag officials had already said,
leave us out of that. We're pretty satisfied with how food and ag is going, and so those were never really brought in to the agreement.
South Korea is already our 6th largest market for U.S. food and ag products. Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Washington.
And the USDA's long-term projections through the year 2028 show corn acreage gaining more ground next year, jumping to 92 million acres and hovering near that level over the next decade. Soybean acreage is expected to fall to 82.5 million acres in 2019 and 2020 before slowly gaining acreage through the end of the projection period. And wheat acreage could see a bump to 51 million acres next year and is projected to hover in a range between 48 and 50 million acres in the succeeding years. Now, the USDA's projections for next year are generally in line with what market watchers have been expecting. A variety of early acreage forecasts call for an increase in corn acres, most ranging between 92 and 93 million acres, amid abundant U.S. soybean supplies due to a record large crop this year and the ongoing trade dispute with China. Next up for you on Agriculture Today, this week's edition of Tree Tales with K-State forester Charlie Barden. Charlie?
Today I will provide some tips on buying firewood to get the maximum heat value for your money and effort. Oak is the most common premium firewood, but did you know that a pound of cottonwood logs has just as much heat value as a pound of oak? This is because the heat value of wood depends on the density of that wood, and firewood is not sold by weight usually, but by cord volume. Thus, that cord of oak will have over twice the heat value as the cord of cottonwood. A full cord measure is equivalent to a well-stacked pile of wood which measures 128 cubic feet, usually stacked 4 feet high by 8 feet long and 4 feet deep. An average-sized home in Kansas heated only with wood may use 4 to 5 cords per winter. Often firewood is sold by the truckload, though, and it can be difficult to know how much you are getting. A standard half-ton pickup cannot really hold a full cord of wood, because it cannot be stacked 4 feet high, not to mention the fact that the cord of wood would weigh well over 2 tons. So the best way to determine if you're receiving an honest cord of wood is to stack it yourself. That pile should end up being 128 cubic feet, multiplying the length by the width by the height. Mixed hardwood is another term often used, which can mean several things. If the mixed hardwood cord contains mostly locust, hackberry, and ash, there is plenty of heat value there. But if the mixed hardwood is mostly elm, silver maple, or cottonwood, it may not be a bargain unless it costs only half as much as the cord of oak logs. Also realize that some of the woods can have as much heat value as oak, such as black and honey locust, while a few have even more heat value than our classic oak. For example, hedge and hickory are denser than oak and thus provide more BTUs and heat value. You've been listening to Tree Tales. I'm Charles Barden, a forester with K-State Research and Extension.
Thanks, Charlie. Jeff Wickman has this week's 4-H segment next for you on Agriculture Today. Legal and financial concerns surround the day-to-day management of the agricultural industry. Producers, ag creditors, and USDA agencies rely on Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services. If you've received an adverse decision from the USDA or have an ag credit concern, call today, 800-321-3276, or visit us online, Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services, exploring options, generating solutions.
This is Agriculture Today. I'm Jeff Wickman. Sydney Beesley, a 4-H member from Hugoton in Stevens County in southwest Kansas, recently performed at the National 4-H Hall of Fame ceremony near Washington, D.C. K-State 4-H specialist Pam van Horn, who oversees the 4-H horse program, has been a fan of Sydney's for a number of years and has heard her sing the national anthem at horse shows and at the Kansas State Fair. Pam also attended the Hall of Fame ceremony. Pam, first off, maybe just some background on the National 4-H Hall of Fame and the performance.
The National 4-H Hall of Fame was started in 2002 to celebrate 4-H's beginning. I know each state has a different year when it started, but that was collectively 2002 that we celebrated the centennial. And it was to honor pioneers, outstanding 4-H volunteers, employees, and financial supporters. The first year they honored 100 delegates, and each year we induct anywhere from 14 to 16 new laureates from across the United States.
Kansas did not have any laureates this year, but we did have a performer, and she's on the phone with us right now. Sydney, a little bit of background maybe on how, first of all, you were selected for this.
Yeah, Nancy Hoenick, our local extension agent, she actually introduced me to the idea, and she brought a paper to me to our church, actually, and she was like, hey, Sydney, you should send in auditions for this. And so she helped me get all that together and get the information that I needed. And so I actually sent in a video from a performance at National 4-H Congress from last year that I was able to perform at, and then a performance from a local talent show here. Then as a couple months went by, I was kind of really nervous to hear whether I got it or not, because I figured that I should have heard by now. So I was like, oh, no, I didn't get it. And so I got the news that I had received the honor to be able to sing there, and I was absolutely ecstatic to be able to go to D.C. and meet all these new people and the laureates who I got to talk more to the next morning at the breakfast. I had the opportunity to sit down and talk to a few of them and really get to know them more, and honestly just talk to them about their experience in 4-H, because they've had so much more experience than I have. And it was just really nice to be able to talk to people who had so much influence through 4-H and everything that they had done.
What was the song that you performed, or did you do several?
I performed 2 songs. I did a jazz rendition of Somewhere Over the Rainbow, which I figured was pretty fitting being from Kansas. And then I did This Is Me from The Greatest Showman.
And what was the reaction from the crowd?
It was really good. The room was smaller, so both the songs were pretty big songs. So it filled the room really big, and it was really fun to see everybody, and it was just a really great experience altogether.
I guess I got to ask, how about the nerves? Were you nervous or anxious to perform?
Actually, it was one of the easiest performances I've had. I performed quite a bit, and so it's weird because I always get nervous before I perform. Doesn't matter if it's in front of thousands of people or 10 people, I always get nervous. But for this one, we had quite a bit of time to get to know the other performers and the people running it, and I got up there and I knew that all the people out there were 4-H'ers just like I was, and they were very forgiving, and so I actually wasn't too nervous. It was really fun. Really, really great experience altogether.
How did your 4-H experience really play into this? Did this help kind of calm the nerves a little bit?
Yeah, of course. Through 4-H, I've done not only just with my singing performances, but with like public speaking and all of that. It's really just grown my confidence on stage and in front of large groups of people. I see that through my performing and through speeches that I have to give at school or anywhere, honestly, just being thrown into a situation and asked to present something or asked to speak in front of people. I just have so much more confidence because of what 4-H has given me.
Pam was telling me off air that you have performed at some of the horse shows and have done the national anthem, so this is really nothing new to you.
Yeah, I've been performing for, well, it'd be about 14 years now. So since I was 3, I've been performing on stage in front of people. So yeah, a lot through 4-H, like you said, with the national anthem at 4-H events or at the horse show and on the grandstands at the state fair, just all sorts of things, performing all the time.
Is this something that you maybe see in your future, something you want to continue to do?
Yeah, I plan on singing for the rest of my life, of course. I don't know if it's something I'd like to go into professionally. I like to do other things, but yeah, singing, of course, for the rest of my life is something that God has really gifted me with, and I'd like to use that for His glory all the time.
What are some of the other things that you're doing in 4-H? What are some of the other programs that you're involved with?
I'm really big in the horse project because, again, been doing horses for my whole life also. My mom grew up showing horses, and so really big in that. Whenever I first started 4-H, I decided that I wanted to show goats, which is something my family has never done before. So my dad got me a goat, and we've been raising goats and doing that, and my dad raises cattle, so we do a bunch of cattle stuff too. Performing arts is definitely my biggest, though, and I've taken it to a leadership level now at this point as I'm getting older, and stepping into that leadership role, I've started to give singing lessons to younger 4-H'ers and just younger students around my town, and I've really grown that into kind of a business of its own to be able to give back to the community and to kids who are coming into that, and hopefully we'll see some of those get up to these national levels at some point.
I got to assume that maybe this performance of the National 4-H Hall of Fame may be the highlight of the year so far?
Yes, of course. I have been trying to go somewhere every year and do something through either 4-H or FFA. So for the past 2 years, I've been going to the National FFA Convention in Indianapolis, and this year I decided that 4-H is kind of more the direction I'd like to go with my accomplishments and where I want to really strive towards. And so whenever Nancy brought that to me, I was super stoked to be able to go through with a traveling opportunity and do it through 4-H.
And Pam got to go on this trip as well. Is she a good person to travel with?
Yes, I actually didn't get to travel with her, but it was really great sitting in there for our rehearsal times and seeing Pam walk in, just a familiar face, super friendly. Love Pam.
And I imagine, Pam, it was really nice for you to have someone who's obviously got a great talent have a chance to really show off that talent.
Oh, I think it's wonderful. I just love seeing Kansas represented at the National 4-H Hall of Fame. There's wonderful, talented kids all over the United States, but it's kind of heartwarming when you know that one's from Kansas and you can feel good about your state and your kids, and so it's just fun to be there.
And somebody who's involved with the horse program as well.
Oh, yes. I have all these assignments, including horse, and that's kind of where I met Sydney, so I am just really pleased for her, and it just warms my heart that she had this opportunity.
That's K-State 4-H specialist Pam van Horn. She and Sydney Beesley, a 4-H member from Stevens County in southwest Kansas, recently attended the National 4-H Hall of Fame ceremony near Washington, D.C., where Sydney performed 2 songs. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.